In the history of fame, music, and culture, they stood like giants at the center. But in the end, their last act wasn't on stage or behind a podium. It was in death. One final appearance that stunned the world. From the leader who defied the order of things, to the star who moonwalked into legend, to the boy whose face lit a revolution, these are 15 famous lives, remembered in open caskets. Number 15. Emmett Till. What does it take to shatter the silence of a bleeding nation? Is it a mother's courage, refusing to let the world look away? Or the raw face of racism carved in flesh? More than 70 years ago, America saw one of the most brutal racial murders. A crime so hideous, it bent the arc of civil rights forever. The victim, a boy, 14, too young to even grasp the cruelty waiting for him. Born in Chicago, 1941, Emmett Till was just a regular kid. Laughter, friends, just a normal life. Until late August, 1955. That summer, he left the city for Mississippi to visit his uncle, to see the rural South for the first time. But 3 days in, the story twisted. He and a few cousins went to Bryant's grocery for candy. Inside was Carolyn Bryant. She later claimed he whistled at her, said he made lewd remarks, said he looked at her wrong. And in that lie, history cracked. 4 nights later, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam came armed and ready. They stormed his uncle's home, dragged Emmett into the dark. He vanished into Mississippi's silence. 3 days of searching ended at the Tallahatchie River, his body chained to a cotton gin fan, barbed wire cutting into his neck, a bullet in his skull, his face destroyed beyond recognition. Back in Chicago, the call every mother dreads came. Mamie Till Mobley's only son was gone. She demanded his body back, but when the coffin arrived, what she opened was horror. A child beaten into something unrecognizable. The funeral home urged a closed casket. She refused. She wanted the world to see. Let them witness what they did to my boy, and they did. Thousands filed past his open coffin. A photograph captured the hideous reality, his swollen, shattered face. That image ripped across the nation, forced America to stare at hatred in its rawest form. Emmett's face became a rallying cry, a wound that would not close. But tragedy is not bound to one time, or one boy. It changes faces, it wears disguises, and sometimes it even moonwalks in sequins. Number 14. Michael Jackson. He was 6 when the spotlight found him, lead singer of a family band. By adulthood, he wasn't just famous, he was global, a superstar, a phenomenon. But one day, his voice stopped. His heart stopped. Michael Jackson wasn't just the king of pop, the man who sold out stadiums. He was the figure in sequins who made rivals dance side by side, who stitched the world together with music. And then came June 25, 2009, 2:26 p.m. After an hour of frantic CPR, silence, gone. 50 years old, 750 million albums, 13 Grammys. A legacy that looked immortal until it wasn't. But death wasn't the end, it was the spark. Hours after the announcement, the internet crashed. Servers buckled under billions of clicks. The world froze, desperate for answers, desperate to believe or not believe the news. 12 days later, the Staples Center became a shrine, a funeral, a spectacle of grief broadcast worldwide. 3 billion people watched, a number so staggering it blurred into myth. But before the cameras rolled, there was a quiet moment. The family gathered around a golden casket, his face finally at peace. No masks, no headlines, just Michael. His children, Paris, Prince, Blanket, looked at him one last time. And as the world mourned, the echoes reached backward to another legend, buried decades earlier, mourned the same way. Different song, but same silence. Number 13. Martin Luther King. Have you ever heard a dream so powerful it outlives the dreamer? Martin Luther King Jr. had one. A vision of a nation where skin didn't decide worth, where children were judged by character, not color. But in one moment, that hope was ripped apart, and unity was reborn in grief. April 4th, 1968. Morning came ordinary. By evening, history broke. At 6:01 p.m., King stepped onto the balcony of room 306 at the Lorraine Motel. Across the street, James Earl Ray was waiting, rifle loaded, sight fixed. One pull of the trigger, and the voice that led the Montgomery bus boycott, that marched on Washington, that thundered from the mountaintop, was gone. He was 39, too young. But death wasn't the end of his impact. It was the funeral that showed his true power. 300,000 people came. They filed past his mahogany casket. Coretta Scott King insisted it stay open. His face looked peaceful, untouched by violence. The procession stretched for miles. A simple farm wagon, pulled by 2 mules, carried him through Atlanta's streets. Behind it, black and white, rich and poor, walked together. In death, King achieved what he fought for in life: unity. And yet, his story wasn't the only one. Another voice, another legend, would find unity in her music, and even in her death. Number 12. Selena Quintanilla. She took Tejano music from what it was to what it is now. But in one moment, her light was snuffed out by a trusted ally. Credited as the queen of Tejano music and as Tejano Madonna for her fashion choices, Selena Quintanilla was a sweetheart who had the world at her feet and her life ahead of her. But on March 31, 1995, she collapsed in the lobby of a Corpus Christi motel where she stayed after being attacked by her boutique manager. From humble beginnings in Lake Jackson, Texas, Selena had built an empire. Her family's restaurant had failed, but music had saved them. And by the time she was 23, she had won a Grammy, sold millions of albums, and was poised to cross over into English-language pop music. But jealousy, envy, and greed in the form of Yolanda Saldivar cut her life short. On the day of her death, Selena had met with Yolanda at the hotel to discuss Selena's finances. What could go wrong? Unknown to Selena, everything did. Yolanda brought a gun, and what should have been a civil discussion turned badly when she shot Selena in the shoulder. Fighting for her life, Selena ran to the lobby, but she succumbed to her injuries due to severe blood loss. Her death rocked the world, with over 3,000 fans showing up for her vigil, and about 40,000 more showing up to her funeral and open-casket viewing. Inside, Selena wore the outfit she had planned for her next music video, a purple jumpsuit that sparkled under the lights. United in her grief, the world watched her one last time. But across the continent, an African man who united his people received nothing short of a hero's funeral. Number 11. Nelson Mandela. He was born into a world that denied his humanity, but he refused to accept the limitations imposed by apartheid. When he challenged the apartheid regime, he had his first run-in with the law and was arrested. But while 27 years behind bars could have broken any man, Mandela came out of it unbroken, unbowed, and remarkably resilient. But his life journey was far from over. In 1994, at the age of 75, Mandela achieved what seemed impossible. He became South Africa's first black president through democratic elections. But like all great men, Mandela's life came to an end. On December 5, 2013, the world stood still to remember a legend. In a modest hospital room in Johannesburg, the man who had transformed a nation drew his final breath at the age of 95. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the South African freedom fighter, prisoner, president, and global icon, had completed his extraordinary journey. When news of Mandela's death spread, South Africa wept as one. The country had lost a president, a leader, and a father, and was to be honored as such. For 3 days, the country paid their last respect to the former president with a state funeral. The state funeral, held on December 15, 2013, in his ancestral village of Kanu, brought together kings and presidents, celebrities and citizens. But even as his body was finally lowered, his spirit remains uncontained, living on in the lives of South Africans. But just like Mandela, another global star united the world with a different kind of entertainment. Number 10. Bruce Lee. He defied gravity with his swift martial art moves that the cameras could not capture. But on July 20, 1973, in Hong Kong, the impossible happened. Bruce Lee, the man who seemed invincible, was found unresponsive in his apartment by producer Raymond Chow around 9 p.m. Raymond, who was supposed to meet with Bruce for dinner, decided to check on him when he didn't show up, but when he got there, he found Bruce unconscious. He tried to revive him but failed, and when medical help finally arrived, they were unsuccessful either. At the hospital, the doctors delivered the heartbreaking news: Bruce Lee was dead. He was healthy and just 32 years old. So how could a man whose body moved like liquid fire suddenly die? An autopsy revealed the hidden truth. He had cerebral edema, a brain swelling that had already been diagnosed the previous month. But while questions of his death circulated, the entertainment industry gathered to pay its respects. On July 25th, 5 days after his death, Bruce Lee was laid to rest at the Kowloon Funeral Parlor with over 30,000 mourners in attendance. The funeral home was filled with white chrysanthemums, the Chinese flower of grief, and when they opened the casket, thousands saw not a legend, but a father and husband. At the time, it was the largest Hong Kong funeral as the crowd came to get one last glance of the martial arts warrior. But just like Bruce Lee, another famous person was loved by all, even in death. Number 9. Princess Grace of Monaco. What happens when the final moments of one of the most glamorous women in the world begin not with a car crash, but with a tragic anomaly in her mind? Her life was at its peak, but Princess Grace of Monaco, formerly known as Grace Kelly, tragically passed away on September 14, 1982. She had traded Tinseltown for a throne and was driving with her daughter Stephanie when their Rover 3500 plunged down a 45-foot embankment. The accident may have killed her, but what the world did not know was the diagnosis that came before. The stroke came first, taking over control of Grace's body as she drove down the roads of Monaco. Grace, the woman who had captivated Hitchcock and charmed a prince, died the next day in Princess Grace Hospital, named in her honor just 3 years earlier. In that moment, Monaco faced a crisis beyond grief. But none could match the grief of her husband, Prince Rainier. To honor her, Grace was to be laid in state for all to revere, but this would be no spectacle. The Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate became a sanctuary of sorrow. She lay in a simple wooden casket, wearing the same shade of blue that had made her eyes legendary on screen. Over 400 people gathered, including the ghosts of old Hollywood, Cary Grant, Nancy Reagan, the wife of the US president at the time, Ronald Reagan, and Princess Diana of Wales. The star herself shone even in death, her face serene and at peace. The camera loved her in life, and in death, it captured the heartbreak of the world. And speaking of tragedies, another world star was put on display one final time after his death by family. Number 8. Marvin Gaye. On the first day of April 1984 in Los Angeles, Marvin Gaye Jr. argued with his father over money and insurance documents in the early hours of the day. The man who had sung What's Going On was asking the very same question about his own finances and life. At 44, Marvin had one more day before his next birthday, but sadly, he did not live to see it. In the days before, Marvin's parents had argued relentlessly about misplaced insurance letters, but on that day, Marvin intervened and told his father to leave his mother alone. Marvin Gaye Sr. failed to let the matter die and instead brought it up once again, until Marvin stepped in once again and physically attacked his own father. In anger and retaliation, Marvin the Sr. shot his son dead. The gunshot came at 12:38 p.m. Marvin the Sr. pulled the trigger of a .38 revolver on his son, hitting him in the left shoulder. He came closer and fired again at point-blank range at his son's chest, effectively killing him. 4 days later, a star-studded open-casket funeral was held for Marvin at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park. For a man of his talents, about 10,000 mourners showed up to take one last look at Marvin Gaye Jr. As he lay in a gold-plated casket, wearing a white military-style jacket that recalled his father's service. It was the sight of his family and loved ones that broke hearts. Gone was the prince of soul music and a legend. Number 7. Vladimir Lenin. He was not just put on display for the world to see when he died, he continued to remain on display years after his death. On January 21, 1924 in Moscow, Vladimir Lenin, the father of the Soviet Union, lay dying in Gorky, his brain ravaged by strokes that had stolen his speech, his movement, his dream, and his revolution. In a shocking twist, the man who had promised to shake the world was leaving it behind. But death in communist Russia was not the end of service to the state, and Vladimir would learn about that in death. Joseph Stalin, Vladimir's successor, made a decision that would horrify Vladimir's widow. They would preserve his body forever in eternal memory of him. The open casket would not only be a funeral, but an eternal display of communism's answer to religious relics. Soviet scientists working in secret pumped the body full of formaldehyde and other chemicals, and the brain was removed for study, seeking the source of revolutionary genius in gray matter. What remained was arranged in a temporary wooden mausoleum in Red Square. On the day of his funeral, the casket opened to reveal Lenin in a simple black suit, his beard neatly trimmed, hands folded as if he were merely sleeping. But those who had known him recognized the truth. This was not the fiery orator who had stormed the Winter Palace. This was a symbol, carefully crafted for a world that needed its martyrs to be eternal. Thousands of people filed past that first day, Many wept, others stared in wonder. Children were lifted to see the man who had promised them a worker's paradise. The line stretched for miles through Moscow's bitter winter, but his widow, who watched from the side, knew that this was wrong. She knew he had wanted to rest beside his mother in St. Petersburg, but instead, he became the Soviet Union's most visited museum piece. But decades after his death, Vladimir remains on display, whereas a voice that rose in America years later was laid to rest. Number 6. Malcolm X. When he lived, he was a revolutionary and a prominent voice and figure in the civil rights movement, until his life was cut short in 1965. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X stepped to the podium to address the Organization of Afro-American Unity, but he never made it back down alive. The first shots came from the front row. Shotgun pellets tore through his chest. Two men rushed the stage with pistols, and in seconds, the man who had evolved from Malcolm Little to Detroit Red to Malcolm X to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz was dying on the ballroom floor. He was taken to the hospital, but at 3:30 p.m., Malcolm X was pronounced dead by 21 identified gunshot wounds to the chest, arms, legs, and shoulder. But who dared end the life of a great man such as Malcolm? The Nation of Islam had declared him a traitor after his pilgrimage to Mecca changed his views on race and integration. Friends turned enemies, and his former brothers had become his executioners. But in death, Malcolm belonged to a movement larger than any organization. 2 days later, Unity Funeral Home in Harlem became the center of a nation's mourning. About 30,000 people filed past his casket to catch a last glimpse of Malcolm as he lay in a dark suit, his hands folded and his face bearing the peace that had eluded him in his final, dangerous year. But it was the sight of his casket, surrounded by red roses and white carnations, that seared itself into memory. Here was a man who had preached black pride and self-determination, reduced to silence by the very forces he had challenged. Number 5. Abraham Lincoln. He had just freed millions of slaves and saved the Union when destiny struck the hardest at him. On April 14, 1865, a bullet from John Wilkes Booth's gun silenced America's hero at Ford's Theater in Washington. Abraham Lincoln, the nation's president, lay dying, and no one could save him. Throughout the night, doctors fought to save him, but by the early hours of the morning, the 16th President of the United States was gone. What followed after was an array of activities to save the president's life and capture the perpetrator. While John was captured, attempts to save the 16th President of the United States failed, and Abraham died the next morning. As the current president, Abraham was deserving of the honorary funeral he got. For 3 weeks, the country and the world mourned the president in a service that included train trips through 7 states, processions, and a lying in state where Abraham was laid out for people to pay their respects. But Abraham's funeral train carried more than a coffin. It transported a country's shattered dreams. From Washington to Springfield, Illinois, over 1.6 million Americans lined the tracks. At each stop, Lincoln lay in state with his casket open, his gaunt features peaceful despite the violence that claimed him. And in New York City alone, more than 100,000 people filed past his remains in a single day. The knowledge that America's great emancipator had been struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph weighed heavily on the heart. But as mourners filed past Lincoln's casket in Springfield State House, few could have imagined that 138 years later, a famous figure would be laid to rest and remembered for her songs. Number 4. Etta James. Etta James entered the world fighting, but her fight paid off in the end. Born James Etta Hawkins on January 25, 1938, to a mother who would abandon her and a father she never knew, Etta fought for everything she had and earned it. She left it the same way, battling leukemia and dementia until her final breath on January 20, 2012. But somewhere between her birth and death, she gifted the world with a voice so powerful and music so sensational.
Oh, sometimes I get a good feeling, yeah.
Her funeral at Greater Bethany Community Church in Riverside drew mourners who understood they were witnessing the end of an era. Stevie Wonder sang, Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, and Christina Aguilera honored Etta with a performance of one of her songs. But during her open-casket funeral, those who approached saw not just a dead singer, but the final chapter of American rhythm and blues history. She had survived heroin addiction, abusive relationships, and an industry that chewed up black women and spit them out. Yet here she lay, victorious in defeat. In life, her struggle with addiction and mental illness had been public, painful, and ultimately redemptive. But she regained her honor even before she died when she faced hers on stage, in interviews, and in her music. But if Etta James represented the beautiful brokenness of human struggle, another woman who died earlier embodied an entirely different kind of spiritual journey. Number 3. Mother Teresa. They say a good name is better than riches, but Mother Teresa took it personally and made not just a good name, but an eternal one for herself. She lived a life so pure that she became the symbol of generosity and charity after her death. Mother Teresa died as she had lived, surrounded by the poor in Calcutta on September 5, 1997. Born Anjese Gongsha Bojakshu in Macedonia on August 26, Mother Teresa spent her life ministering to those the world forgot. Now, the world would not forget her. While visiting the Pope in 1983, Mother Teresa had her first signs of failing health in the form of a heart attack. 6 years later, she had a second attack and had to get a pacemaker. In 1991, she had a bout of pneumonia, and that was followed by a cracked collarbone after a fall in 1996. The next year, she died after resigning as the head of the Missionaries of Charity. To honor her, her body lay in state at St. Thomas Church in Calcutta, dressed in her trademark white sari with blue borders, and her casket was opened to the public for a week. From every corner of the world, mourners trooped in to respect the symbol of generosity and charity. Here was a woman who had owned nothing yet possessed everything. She had touched the untouchables and loved the unlovable. Indian government officials provided a state funeral, an honor typically reserved for heads of state. The irony wasn't lost on observers. A woman who had rejected worldly recognition was being celebrated by the very institutions she had challenged through her radical compassion. But just 15 years after Mother Teresa's funeral, another open casket would draw crowds, this time for a man who sang to the world. Number 2. James Brown. The stage lights dimmed for the last time. Why? Because the man who commanded audiences to get up would never rise again. On Christmas Day 2006, James Joseph Brown Jr., the godfather of soul, drew his final breath at Emory Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta. But death could not silence the man who had spent 6 decades making the world move to his rhythm. James didn't just perform music, he embodied it. And even though his waning health started warning him, James continued performing even in his 70s. Unfortunately, his heart gave up and stopped beating on Christmas morning of 2006. The world, it erupted in chaos to the reaction of his death. The man who had given his heart to millions of fans finally gave it up completely. Radio and television stations played his music non-stop, but the true highlight was the funeral service. 2 days after his death, a public memorial service was held for James at the Apollo Theater in New York, and 2 days later, a private one was held at James Brown Arena. But while he lay in full view of fans, friends, and family, and his backup band played some of his hits, it became clear at that time what the world had lost. And just like James, the world lost a woman whose voice had been both a blessing and a curse. Number 1. Whitney Houston. Her voice could reach notes that seemed to touch heaven itself and connect the world, yet she died alone in a Beverly Hills hotel bathtub on February 11, 2012. Whitney Houston gave us hit covers like I Will Always Love You and songs like Greatest Love of All, but her death was one of the most painful tragedies the world had ever seen. In reports, she succumbed to accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use, all of which contributed to her death. And when the news went viral, fans, family, and friends were shocked. Her funeral at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, became a celebration of both triumph and tragedy. The open casket revealed Whitney in an eternal peaceful slumber as the world watched. Her mother, Sissy, herself a renowned gospel singer, looked upon the daughter whose gift had become both salvation and destruction. Kevin Costner, her co-star in the 1992 movie The Bodyguard, delivered a eulogy that captured Whitney's duality, the church girl from Newark who had conquered the world only to be conquered by her own demons, the woman who had sold over 200 million records, who had transformed pop music, and who had broken barriers for black women in entertainment, was finally resting. Whitney's casket was eventually closed for the funeral service, but those who had seen her in repose carried the image forever. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe!